Welcome, everybody. Again, I'm not sure what you heard, but my name is Neil Thompson, as Beth said. Thank you all for being here. And we're going to be talking about engineers and talking and presenting to non-technical audiences. I I live here in Southern California, just outside of San Diego, in a city called Vista. But I'm not from California, and I'm not even from this country. I'm actually from Canada. I'm not from Nova Scotia, though. I'm from Ontario, a city called Brampton, just outside of Toronto. I've been in the U.S. almost 20 years now, so it's been a minute. And what brought me out here was a job to work at a spinal device company. But even before that, when I graduated from school, I got a job at a startup in the Boston area, and I was working as a research associate. And the job required no speaking in front of people whatsoever, and that's something that I didn't care. I wasn't upset about. We'll say. I did a lot of work in the lab. I did a lot of testing, a lot of experimenting, writing protocols, writing reports, and that's essentially it. I did that for about 2 years. I got bored of it. I wanted a challenge, more of a challenge, and I took a job just outside of San Diego. That's what brought me to California at a spinal device company. For those of you all that don't know much about spinal devices, typically they're made out of metal or ceramic, but in this instance, I was making implants out of human cadaver bone. So if any of you all are donors, and obviously when you die, they don't take the bones when you're still living. Your bones can be used for implants, and those implants can be used to make well spinal implants. And we get the bones from tissue banks, and if you've ever been to a tissue bank, it's quite the experience. The smell of bone being cut is a smell that you'll never forget, and it's not a pleasant smell. I'll say. But that's the job that I was doing. I was a product development engineer at this company, and I was doing a lot of testing, a lot of experimenting, a lot of writing protocols and reports, very similar to what I was doing in Boston up until a few months of the job. My boss called me into his office and said that I was going to be a project lead. And I want to know what's a project lead. Essentially, at this company, they were too cheap to hire project managers, so they put that responsibility on the product development engineers. And so at this point now, I have to give project progress updates to senior management on a monthly basis. We're talking the CEO, VP of R&D, VP of marketing, anybody with a corner office really was in that audience. And I had to tell them about the project that the team was working on and the updates on it, the project progress. Let me tell you, those first few presentations, they were absolutely horrendous. I did not know it was possible to sweat that profusely from one's body, but there I was. I mean, the dry cleaning bills were ridiculous. And you would have thought that I would have gotten better over time, and eventually I did. But the first few presentations, number one, number two, number three, even number four, if I'm being honest, they were absolutely horrible. And what I would do is I would slap a bunch of stuff on PowerPoint slides. I'd get up there, I'd read them, and then try to get out of there as quickly as possible. But I never got out of there as quickly as possible. What ended up happening is the CEO, the VP of R&D, the VP of marketing, anybody else in the audience would ask me questions that I thought I had answered during the presentation. But because I didn't put it in such a way that these people could understand, many of them were non-technical, I suppose with the exception of the VP of R&D, well, I didn't put it in a way they could understand. So now I'm getting these questions, and it essentially was a waste of my time and their time as well. I ended up sitting in on some of the other presentations from project leads, and they were all product development engineers too. And I noticed their presentations weren't all that much better than mine. So all of us, it would seem, had this issue of taking our technical expertise and putting it in such a way that these non-technical people could understand. And I eventually got the message that this is something I needed to get better at because my project got canceled. All these years later, and this is 10 plus years ago, I truly believe that if I was better at the time at presenting the information, perhaps the project could have been saved, but I suppose we'll never know. But that project being canceled was the catalyst that I needed to realize that presenting in front of people, especially non-technical audiences, is something that I needed to get better at. And so I got to it. So how did I go about that? Well, I was assigned to other projects and I had to give those presentations on those as well. Also, I used the team meetings as sort of a precursor, a precursor for the presentations I had to give in front of management, kind of, I guess, practice to see if what I was saying was going over well with them, because some of them weren't technical either. I mean, the teams were made up of myself, the product development lead, and then there was a marketing person, manufacturing person, quality person, operations person. Not all of them were technical, so I could go over what I was going to say, and they gave me feedback on whether they thought this was going to land with the people that I was going to be presenting to for project status updates, and that was very helpful. And then I joined Toastmasters. And for those of you all that don't know about Toastmasters, it's an international organization whose goal is to help people with their public speaking. It's an excellent forum to practice public speaking. And so I was a member, no matter where I was living at the time. Even when I left that particular job, I joined a Toastmasters group and practiced giving presentations. It certainly helped. And essentially, I took everything that I learned in becoming more effective in presenting in front of people, and I turned it into an online course. And the course is called Teach the Geek to Speak. It's geared towards people like me, or people like us, engineers, those in the STEM fields who want to get better at presenting, especially in front of non-technical audiences. There certainly are a lot of instances where we have to present in front of people, and those who are best at it tend to get further ahead than those who aren't. And that's a pill that I had to swallow, a lesson that I had to learn, but I certainly did learn it. So now I want to present, well, when you all signed up for this webinar, you were told there was going to be learning about presenting in front of non-technical audiences, of course, being able to keep their attention while maintaining the integrity of the data that you have. But then there's also a process that I developed that I really like. And the reason I like it is because it's repeatable. You don't have to recreate the wheel every time you have to put a presentation together. You just use that process and you can practice and present any presentation that you have to give. So I'll get into the tips and then I'll present the process and we'll go from there. So the first tip, and this is something that I didn't appreciate when I first started giving presentations, and that is knowing your audience. I mentioned I would put a bunch of things on slides, try to make it look pretty, and get up there and read them. I didn't even practice beforehand. I would get up, read the slides, and then try to get out of there as quickly as possible. But I never got out of there as quickly as possible because I get questions afterwards that I thought I had answered. Well, obviously I didn't answer them. I didn't put it at least well enough in the presentation to have avoided those questions. And that really stemmed from not really taking the wants and needs of my audience into account when I was putting the presentation together. And it showed. The presentations didn't have to go the way they did. It certainly could have been easier on all of us. It wouldn't have been a waste of my time and their time. And at least looking back on it now, a tip that I have for presenting in front of management or just presenting in front of people at a company, people that you're going to see often, is, well, with respect to the management. Oftentimes these people in management, they're busy. They're not able to see you to talk about any kind of presentation they had to do. I mentioned there were a number of projects that were going on at the company at the time. Can you imagine if every engineer tried to come in and ask them about the presentation that they're going to be giving for project status updates? It would take up a lot of their time. So what I used to do is I used to go to their admins and I would ask them, what kind of information do I need to put into this presentation to keep the attention of your boss? And it was very effective because that person is the management person's right-hand man or woman. They know them really well. And so they'd be able to give a response as to what needs to be in the presentation to engage that particular person. And then I just make sure that that information was in the presentation. And that was really helpful, especially with the project status updates, because as I mentioned, there was a number of them. So this is a full day affair for these management types. They had to be sitting there all day, just back-to-back presentations. So if you were going to put stuff into that presentation that they actually care about, well, you've increased the likelihood of them actually listening. And ultimately, that's what you want. And I'm a big fan of this number one tip. I remember being at a networking event once, and it was on marketing, and I don't know anything about marketing. And they were using a whole lot of words that I didn't understand. And I had to ask them afterwards, during the Q&A section, what those words meant. I mean, if they had explained them during the presentation, well, firstly, I wouldn't have had to ask those questions. And secondly, it wouldn't have been so difficult for me to follow the presentation, because now I'm trying to figure out, what does this word mean? What does that word mean? And it really hurts my ability to really listen and comprehend what they're talking about. So this tip is really important. Just knowing your audience when you're putting your slides together, when you're putting your presentation together. This next tip has to do with slides, and it has to do with words. You see that paragraph on the right? Are you reading it right now? It's either you're reading it or you're completely ignoring it. And if you're reading it, then you're not listening to what I'm saying, because it's very difficult to do multiple things at a time. Multitasking's for the birds. It really is. It's reading that whole paragraph and then listening to me at the same time, it's very difficult to do. So what you're going to do, you're going to make a choice. You're either going to read the paragraph or you're going to listen to what I say. But ultimately, we're engaging in public speaking, not public reading. You don't want to have this big paragraph on a slide for people to read, because if that's the case, you could have just sent them the slides and they could have read the slides at their leisure. You really want them to listen to what you have to say. So I'm a big fan of keeping text to a minimum on a slide, because it eliminates the ability of the audience to read the slide. Either they're going to listen to what you have to say or they're going to ignore you. And I like eliminating that one option, because now you've increased the odds that they actually listen to what you're saying. What I have there on the left is what I prefer. I'd say 3 points at max, and you want to keep those points to as minimum words as possible. And that actually has to do with something called cognitive load. There's only so much information that we can take in at a time. And if you overload people, then you've increased the likelihood of them tuning you out and then just not listening to what you have to say. So I'm a big fan of keeping the text to a minimum, 3 points max. Please keep those paragraphs to writing reports, technical reports, not to your presentations. The next point I have here is about words. I'm not a big fan of ramblers. If you can say your word, if you can convey your thought in as few words as possible, it's always best, because you're going to be able to keep the attention of people who don't like, people that use a whole lot of words, people that ramble. You look at what's on the right and what's on the left. You, the number of words on the right is about half, or on the left, I should say, is about half the words on the right, but it essentially conveys the same thought. So why not use what's on the left? You're going to be a lot better. It's going to be a lot better in keeping people's attention, because you're not rambling. And as I said, rambling's not a good idea. So try to avoid it. This next tip is something that I didn't really think about when I first started giving presentations. And in hindsight, I wish I did, because I'm sure a lot of these questions that I got after the presentations were because of just technical jargon. You're working as an engineer in your domain of expertise. I'm sure there's jargon that other engineers in that domain of expertise understand. But what you need to understand is that other people outside of that domain of expertise don't understand it at all. I mentioned that I worked at a spinal device company, and that company actually was the first company that I worked at that had this particular group called orthobiologics. I mean, I mentioned that I built implants out of human cadaver bone. That's essentially what orthobiologics is. That's the group. Bone is made up of a number of cells, one of which is osteoblast and one is osteoclast. And I can recall, even all these years later, using those terms during these project status updates, and just watching people's eyes actually, I didn't even see their eyes glaze over, because I was looking at my notes. I was looking at the screen. I was reading. I wasn't even looking at the people. But the questions I'd get afterwards: what's an osteoblast? What's an osteoclast? Like, what are you talking about? I could have avoided all these issues if I had used words that were more commonly known. Essentially, an osteoblast is a bone-forming cell, and an osteoclast is a bone-eating cell. For those of you all that are interested, as we grow older, more bone gets laid down by osteoblasts, and then the old bones get eaten by osteoclasts to be replaced by newer osteoblasts. That's essentially how our bones grow, and of course that stops at some point as we get older and osteoporosis sets in. and just that's bad outcomes, I suppose. But bone-forming cells and bone-eating cells, that's something that's memorable, and those are words that everyone should know, as opposed to osteoblast and osteoclast. Try to minimize that technical jargon that you're so used to using with your engineering friends or just engineering colleagues, and especially when presenting in front of non-technical audiences. You want to minimize that jargon and use more commonly used words. It really helps with retention and engagement as well. A call to action. Again, almost all these tips are things that I did not take into account during those first few presentations I had to give in front of management. I would read them, read the slides, get out of there. A call to action is really important. What do you want? What do I do? That's the question you want the people in the audience to have to answer after your presentation. Well, at least in my case, when it came to project status updates, what do I want them to do? Well, maybe I need more resources to get the project on schedule. Maybe I need more people to help with this project. Maybe I need more time. Well, these are all things that need to be communicated during the meeting. And funny enough, these are not even things I thought about to communicate during these presentations. But it's so important to do because, well, what was the point of the meeting? When it comes to even putting these presentations together, you really should start with that call to action first and then work backwards. So what do the people need, or the people in the audience, what do they need to do for you, or what do they need to get out of this presentation, and then work backwards, and then essentially tailor the rest of the presentation to answering this call to action, or addressing this call to action. And that really was a turning point for me, at least, when it came to putting presentations together, as opposed to just starting from the beginning and working down. You start down, then essentially work up. And that's been really helpful in putting presentations together that mattered, that people paid attention to, and that I got what I needed to get out of the presentation. And they got what they needed to get out of the presentation too. They had their call to action, and so they knew clearly what needed to happen. And so now I'd like to talk about timing. Timing is a pet peeve of mine. I'll admit. God knows I've been in enough presentations where I thought it was going to be 15 minutes. In the agenda, it said it was going to be 15 minutes, but it ended up being 20 minutes. I don't know if you all know this, but I'm actually timing this presentation right now because I want to make sure that it is within time and doesn't go over. People really don't take this into account when even putting their presentations together. They just put slides together and then it just takes as long as it takes. But no, especially when you're presenting in front of management, these are busy people. You want to make sure that the time is well spent and that the time is what they expect it to be. Those project status update meetings were supposed to have a certain time to them, but almost always they went over time. And so the agenda would be pushed. And then people get annoyed. When people are annoyed, they're not going to listen, or there's going to be less of a likelihood that they listen. So when it comes to your presentations, practice them to time. So if you know, for instance, you have 15 minutes to give a presentation, practice it, but don't practice it to 15 minutes. Practice it to 14. You then give yourself a 1 minute buffer, because ultimately, in a lot of cases, you may ad lib something that you didn't when you were practicing your presentation. And if that's the case, well, at least you have that 1 minute buffer to play with to make sure that you still finish within 15 minutes. Plus, no one's ever complained that a meeting was too short. But they certainly complain when they're too long. That's for sure. Filler words. Filler words like so. These can be rather distracting to people. I was a member of Toastmasters, and for those of you all that have ever been to a Toastmasters meeting, they take filler words very seriously. In fact, in some clubs, they even have a fine for using filler words. And I remember at one of the clubs that I was a part of, there was one member who would just put money in the jar right away because he said, I know I'm going to use filler words, so take my money right now. These can be really distracting to some. And then on the other hand, they're not all that distracting to others. But If you want to increase your chances of people listening to your presentation, well, err on the side of caution and try to minimize these filler words so the people that are annoyed by them will listen to your presentation, and then obviously those who aren't annoyed by them will listen to your presentation anyway. I have a YouTube channel and a podcast, and I interview people, mostly engineers and scientists. And I remember one time I was interviewing a guest, and I got a call from my mom afterwards. She listens to a number of the episodes, and she said that I did a great job. But she said that guest I had, after about 5 minutes, I couldn't listen to the presentation anymore. I couldn't listen to the interview anymore. Too many ums. And as I said, there are people out there like my mom who are going to be turned off by the use of these filler words, so try to avoid them. I was actually listening to a presentation not too long ago with a coaching client. He asked me to go over one of his virtual presentations. And within a 45-minute span, he said about 100 times. I actually counted them. I was going to stop after about 20, but I figured I'm all this way deep already. Let me just keep going just to see how far it goes. He did it about 100 times, 45 minutes. Blew my mind. Luckily, I'm one of those people who aren't turned off really by filler words. I'll still listen. But if it was my mom that was doing the evaluating, she would have stopped after those 20 ums and just said, I can't do this. You've got to find somebody else to help you out here with your presentation. So minimize the filler words. It'll only help you. Another tip that I'd like to offer has to do with feedback. And I'm a big fan of getting it because not just with presenting in front of people, but with anything in life, you get better at it just by hearing what others think of it. One thing that I want to say about feedback, though, is don't feel like you need to implement all feedback that you get to appease everybody, because that's not possible. And not only that, you may very well get conflicting feedback. I can recall being when I was a member of Toastmasters, I gave a presentation, and after the presentation, someone said, "I really liked your eye contact," and another person said, "Improve your eye contact." Well, who am I going to listen to? Well, you got to run it through your filter. What do you think about your feet? What do you think about your eye contact? Is that something you need to improve on, or is it something that you're okay with? And if it's something you're okay with and you heard somebody say you need to improve it, well, I guess that's something that you're going to leave to the side. Don't feel like you need to implement all feedback that you get. You can take what you think is important and then leave behind what you don't think is all that important. I mentioned a coaching client that I have. Before I even evaluated his presentation, I asked him, "What do you want me to focus on?" And he was actually kind of caught off guard by the question. But then when he thought about it, it was like, well, these are the things that I want you to focus on. Is my message compelling? Are the people that are looking at the presentation, do they look engaged? What about the flow of the actual presentation? Did it make sense? And those are the things that I focused on. It just so happened those ums just kind of kind of stuck out to me, so I just kept tracking them. He didn't ask me to track the ums. That was more my own thing that I decided to do. But I certainly did focus on the things that he wanted me to give him feedback on. That's another point when it comes to getting feedback. Ask the people that you're getting feedback from for tell them the specific things that you want them to give you feedback on. And hopefully they do that. Maybe they give you a little extra, and then you run it through your filter to see if this is something that is something you want to work on, or something that you can put to the side. But I'm a big fan of getting feedback anyway. It's so important. So this is a slide that I think you should take a screenshot of. It can be really helpful to you. So what you see in that blue box in the white text is 100 words. And if you were to read those 100 words and then divide 100 by the number of minutes it took you to read those words, you'll have your words per minute. Voice speed is something that can be really important when it comes to presenting, especially if you're presenting to a non-technical audience, because you're going to be presenting something that they don't know all that much about. So you don't want to speed through it because then it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to understand. Typically, we speak at 140 words per minute. And from the bit of research I did, I actually saw that it should be 160 words per minute if you're delivering bad news. And the rationale for that is that when you deliver bad news, you want to speed it up so that people have less time to come up with arguments over what you're saying. And it kind of makes sense. So I suppose if your company's going through downsizing and you have to present in front of people, you don't want to say that real slow. Like, we're going through a restructuring and please clean out your desks. You want to just speed right through it and try to get out of there as quickly as possible. And then when it comes to, well, I guess, more technical presentations, because as I mentioned, the a non-technical audience is going to take a little bit more time to understand what you're saying, even if you're not using the technical jargon and using more commonly used words. You want to slow it down. I say between 110 and 140 words per minute to really make sure that these people are taking in what you're saying and comprehending it. So if you haven't taken a screenshot of this slide, again, I highly suggest you do so. Read the words in the white. Take 100, divide by a number of minutes, you'll have your words per minute. And then if you see if it's kind of high, well, try reading a little slower. If it's kind of low, well, speed it up. Eye contact. I mean, I did mention it earlier. Eye contact is important. When I first started giving presentations, I mentioned I would just read the slides. And when you're reading the slides, you're not looking at the people. You're not looking at the audience. You're looking at the slides. You're looking at your notes. And when you do that, people don't feel all that engaged with what you're saying, and then they may very well ignore you. They won't listen to your presentation. They'll stare off into space, look at their phone. They'll do anything but listen to what you have to say. So eye contact's important. At least for me, though, I struggled with eye contact. So when I said in that Toastmasters meeting, someone said, I need to improve my eye contact. Well, I agreed. It's definitely something I need to improve on. But I struggled with it because if I looked at someone in the eyes too long, I'd forget what I was going to say. And ultimately, when you're presenting in front of people, it's important that they remember, or that you remember what you're going to say. Because if not, then you're just staring at them, they're staring at you. Everyone's just, well, what's going on here? So I developed a bit of a hack to get over this eye contact issue that I had, and perhaps it can work for you as well. Instead of looking in people's eyes, I looked at their eyebrows. They can't tell the difference whether you're looking at their eyes or their eyebrows. And I found that by looking at their eyebrows instead, it was easier for me to really remember what I was going to say. And it really helped. It really helped. And so I highly suggest you try it out and let me know how that works for you. Eyebrows instead of pupils. This next tip isn't something that I thought about much at all. And because when I first started giving presentations, I didn't give much thought to the presentation. I slapped slides together. I read them, tried to leave. And I got the results that I got because I didn't put all that much effort into these presentations. But when I started actually seeing myself doing well, that's when I started doing better at presenting in front of people. If you tell yourself that you're a poor public speaker, you likely will be. But if you tell yourself that you're improving at it and you're going to get better, then that's likely what's going to happen. So typically what I do before I give a presentation is I'll close my eyes and I'll take a deep breath and I'll visualize how I want the presentation to go. I did it today before this presentation. My camera worked, my mic worked, the tech worked, people could see the slides, people were following along with the presentation. Perhaps they laughed at appropriate times. I got out what I wanted to get out in the order I wanted to say it. I didn't leave anything out of importance. At the end, people asked questions. I had answers for the questions. And if I didn't have answers for the questions, I admitted I didn't have answers for the questions, but I would find out the answers to those questions to make the next presentation even better. And then when I was done, I said, thank you. and the presentation was over, and then I'd open my eyes. I feel a lot calmer about going on that stage or going in front of that camera to present that presentation. It's made all the difference in just being more poised, being more confident, getting in front of people and presenting. Just visualizing yourself doing well. Don't tell yourself that you're going to wet the bed. Tell yourself the bed will stay dry. So I'm a big fan of it, just visualizing success. And that doesn't even have to do specifically with public speaking or just presenting in front of others. It just has to go to life in general. And now my last tip, and this is something that I certainly didn't do initially. It was something that I was scared to do. And I know a lot of other people aren't that keen on doing it either, but it's been the difference between my presentations being okay and then my presentations being better than okay. And that is videoing yourself. A lot of people don't like to see themselves on camera. A lot of people don't like the sound of their own voice. But let me tell you, if you really want to get better at presenting in front of others, you need to video yourself. The person that I'm coaching through his presentation, if he had videoed himself, I wouldn't have been able to pick out all those the 100 ums. I wouldn't have been able to tell him. And he wouldn't be able to refer back to the video and hear them himself. He may have thought, I didn't use that many. Well, then when he actually hears them and sees them, well, then he knows, oh, wow, there's a lot more ums than I thought. But not only that, when you video yourself, you get to see the things that you actually did well. Don't dwell solely on what you need to improve on, because that can be rather depressing. Actually look and see what did I really like about this presentation as well. It's made, as I said, it's made all the difference in me just becoming better in presenting in front of people. Just even before virtual, when I still did on-site, in-person presentations, I would take my camera, my iPhone, set it up on my stand, and video myself. And I'd look at it afterwards, as uncomfortable as it was, and I'd see all the things I needed to improve on, all the things that I wanted to get better at. For instance, I had a nasty habit of patting my right hand on my leg when I was standing at a podium. And I'd see that. I didn't even realize I was doing it. But if I hadn't videoed the presentation, I would have known I did it. So this is really important. And it's not all that difficult to do, especially if once we go back to on-site presentations. As I said, we all have a camera phone. So you can just buy a stand on Amazon. They're really cheap, $20. Set it up, video yourself, and then study the tape afterwards. And that's how you get better. So let me tell you a bit about this process that I developed. And this process is what I've used again and again, repeatable process to practice and deliver every speech that I have to give. And it's what I talk about in the course, Teach the Geek to Speak. Funny enough, when I first put that course together, there was no process. It was just me sitting at my kitchen table, just talking about the things that I thought were important when it comes to presenting in front of others. And it was actually a friend of mine that I sent the course to who looked at it and said, you need to do better than this. You can't present this to people. And this was an instance where the feedback, I took it in. I didn't leave it to the side. I agreed with her. And I was actually rather embarrassed by the fact that I didn't have a process, considering I worked as an engineer in medical devices, specifically spinal implants, and that's our FDA regulated industry. You have to follow a process to develop a medical device. If not, it could be dire consequences. So the fact that I didn't even think of a process beforehand was rather mind-blowing. But eventually I did develop this process, and I use it again and again. So the first part of the process, understand the audience. What do they want? What do they need from their presentation? What's the expertise of the audience? Are they technical or are they non-technical? Obviously, you're going to present differently based on that. Less technical jargon for the non-technical audience, for instance. Speaking a little slower to make sure that the non-technical audience can really take in what you're saying is another example. Develop a speech structure. I mentioned earlier developing a call to action and then working backwards. That's really important. Have that call to action and then develop the points that lead to that call to action. It really helps in just streamlining the process of putting your presentation together. I highly recommend it. Your timing. Man, I have a friend who makes fun of the fact that when I practice my presentations, I practice them and time them. Because oftentimes when he gives presentations, he just wings it. And it shows. It absolutely shows. There's a lot of ums, a lot of uhs, you knows when he gives presentations, but he won't listen to me. But I'm a big fan of practicing your presentations to make sure that they are within time. I gave the example of if you have 15 minutes to present, practice to 14 so that you have that 1 minute buffer in the event that you ad lib something during the presentation, you still finish within the 15 minutes. Who knows how many presentations could have finished on time if people would just time the presentations and give themselves a little bit extra time when they're practicing. Agendas would be saved all over the world. But the next part of the process is the filler words. You want to appease people like my mom, people that are distracted by filler words. If you're able to keep their attention, then you increase the number of people that will actually listen to your presentation. You know, it's funny when I talk about filler words. I actually read an article once that said that people that use filler words are seen as more conscientious. I guess my mother didn't read that article. And they referred specifically to former President Barack Obama, many of whom think he's a very eloquent speaker. But if you actually listen to any of his speeches, he uses a lot of filler words. But yet people still think he's a great speaker. So go figure. But as I said, but people like my mother, people are distracted by these filler words. You want to increase the number of people who actually listen, minimize them. And how do you minimize them? Video your presentations so you can actually hear them. Because if you're relying solely on memory to remember what filler words you used, you likely will remember that you used way less than you actually did. I highly doubt my coaching client thought he used 100 filler words during his presentation. But because they had the video and I could tell him at 20 minutes and 46 seconds, you said and he actually go back and see that at 20 minutes and 46 seconds, he said he knows I'm not lying, and he knows, well, okay, maybe this is something I should work on. And then the last two are getting feedback and developing a personal inventory. And the main difference between the two of them is the vantage point. When it comes to getting feedback, that's getting feedback from others. And then when it comes to developing a personal inventory, that's self-feedback. That's you looking at the video, you saying what you need to improve on, what you did well. And then when it comes to the feedback, it's what others say you need to improve on, what you did well. And I also mentioned when it comes to feedback, you really want to be mindful of the feedback you actually take in. I'm a big fan of listening to all feedback. Listen to what people have to say. It doesn't mean you have to implement what everyone has to say, because it's very possible that there could be contradictory feedback. I like your eye contact. You need to improve your eye contact. Run it through your filter and see what makes sense to you. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about ways that you can keep in touch with what I'm doing. As I mentioned, I have a YouTube channel, and then I also have a podcast, and there's the link there for you all to go to. I highly suggest it. And for my YouTube channel, I interview people. I interview engineers mostly, and I interview some scientists. They all have in common the fact that they have STEM backgrounds, and we talk about presenting. We talk about public speaking skills, because that's just not something that we're known for. Us engineers, we're known for being very smart, having a lot of technical acumen, technical expertise, but not being the best at presenting it in front of people. But that's something I'd like to change. And the people that I speak to, it's really interesting to learn about their journeys in public speaking. And I ask them questions like, is this something you've always been good at? If not, what'd you do to get better at it? Do you have a process for putting your presentations together? I mean, I mentioned my process, the Teach the Geek process. What's your process in putting your presentations together, if you have one? If you get nervous before giving a speech, how do you deal with your nerves? One thing about nervousness, it's normal to be nervous. It's not something to avoid. Nervousness is a sign that you actually care about what you're talking about. If you're not nervous before you give a presentation, it's because you don't really care about what the people get out of that presentation. So being nervous is fine. It's just being able to manage it. You obviously you don't want to be in front of people sweating and shaking uncontrollably. So I I ask people that I interview, what do you do? What do you do to calm your nerves? And one thing that I do is I visualize success, but then another thing that I do is light exercise. So nothing too crazy. We're not talking about CrossFit or anything. Well, just knee bends. Maybe take a walk before the presentation just to dissipate all that nervous energy. So by the time you hit the stage or you get in front of the camera, you're poised, you're confident, and if you've done that visualization exercise, you really see yourself doing well giving your presentation. It's also really interesting to learn people's journeys. People that I interview start off in one place, and some of them just end up somewhere completely different. One person that I recently interviewed, she got a degree in civil engineering, then she was an attorney, then she was a stay-at-home mom for about 10 years, and now she's a personal stylist. You know, that's obviously a straight line, right? But yeah, it's really interesting to learn the way that people have really taken what they've learned in school and what they've done with it. It's always interesting to learn. And then I have 5 easy public speaking tips for STEM professionals. And you can learn about that at teachthegeek.com/tips. So in addition to the tips that I offered here and the process that I offered here as well, I offer some others that I think could be really helpful to people like us, people that have technical backgrounds, have to give presentations, see the benefit of getting better at it, especially when it comes to talking in front of non-technical audiences. And as your career progresses, that likely will be the case. You have to talk to your team, talk to management, talk to vendors, talk to customers, just other stakeholders. Not all of them, in fact, quite a number of them are not going to have this the same technical background that you have. And how do you communicate with these people to make sure that they understand, especially if they're decision makers? I mean, when I was giving project progress updates, these are the big wigs of the company. These are the people that decide whether you have a job or not. You really want to make sure that you're presenting in such a way that they understand. And they also have the decision-making power, at least in my case, to veto or have projects keep going. I mentioned my project got canceled, and I fully believe it's because I wasn't the best at presenting the information in front of people. If I did a better job of just advocating for that project, maybe I could have saved it. But obviously, we'll never know. So you can go to teachthegeek.com/tips to learn more about that. And that's the end of the presentation, and I can take questions at this time.
Okay, we do have a few questions in the chat. Neil, we lost your camera a little way back, so I don't know if you want to put that on for the question and answer period. So we have a question from Matt Glynn. Do you have specific advice on how to eliminate filler words?
Yes. Can you see me now?
It looks like we might be going to your camera. Let me see if I can spotlight.
Well, you can still hear me, right?
We can still hear you.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's what's important. So when it comes to eliminating filler words, I'm a big fan of videoing yourself so you make sure you can actually hear them. And then it comes down to practicing. And videoing your practicing, or at least doing audio of your practicing as well. It doesn't happen overnight, but the more you practice and the more you're cognizant of the fact that you're using filler words, the more likely it is that as the more presentation that you give, the less likely that you'll use the filler words. I used a lot of filler words when I first started giving presentations, and now I'm sure there still are some filler words. I don't think they ever really go away fully, but I certainly don't use as many as I did when I first started giving presentations. But that just came with time.
Okay, great. So another question here. How do you practice a specific presentation before delivering it? We are so busy, and presentations are a small part of small part of what we do. So how do we manage that? Is there a specific trick to that?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a trick. One thing that's really helpful is presenting in front of others. So I did mention, at least when I worked in corporate, I used the project team as sort of the precursor, I guess, for the presentation that I had to give in front of management. So all the things that you want, all the kinks that you wanted to work out of your presentation, presenting to them instead. It's certainly a less stressful environment presenting to your team, since, well, they can't fire you. so so present to them and they'll give you feedback on what you can improve on, what they liked about your presentation. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, getting the feedback of admins was really helpful for me, and just learning what they thought that their boss would want to see and hear during the presentation was useful, so that I make sure that I was in the presentation, so that by the time I presented in front of these people, well, the presentation was as good as it was going to be. But again, that also comes with time too. The way to get better at public speaking or anything is to start doing it. It's just to not avoid it. It's to look for opportunities to do it, and you get better at it over time. Practice makes progress.
Great. I like those suggestions, particularly practicing in front of your team. So another question here: what if your client wants too many topics to be put in a short presentation? What would you focus on to cut extraneous info out?
Well, I would push back. I would actually push back a bit on that. If there's too much information for the time that you're allotted, you really want to ask them to help you to drill down what are their priorities. If you were to prioritize the various topics, from 1 to 2, 3, 4, that type of thing. Have them do that, and then say, well, I can cover this topic, these 3 topics, in the amount of time that you have allotted, and see what they say. And if you want a longer presentation, then I could potentially get to these other topics. Although I will say that the more topics you have, the more difficult it's going to be to keep the attention of the people in the audience. So that's another thing that you could bring up to them. We could have multiple conversations about all these various topics, but to really get what you want to get out of these presentations, I highly suggest we limit the number of topics per presentation.
Okay, great. Next, we have a comment. Someone said, I appreciate the material presented today. Unfortunately, I have to leave early for a meeting with my boss. I need to brief him on some issues in my unit, but I have an opportunity to take some of this content and put it into practice. I like the have a call to action, which is my main takeaway from this. Thanks, Neil.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
And someone else commented, I always like not the instructions no more than X amount of slides. So I don't know if you have any comments on limiting how many slides are in your slide deck, but.
When it comes to slides, so slides are cool. They're good to have, but ultimately you're more concerned in what people are taking in by what you're saying, not necessarily what they're seeing on the slides. I mentioned trying to keep the number or the text to a minimum. And if you're going to have slides, well, use images instead. I don't know if you all noticed, but quite a number of my slides had images on them, and that was not coincidental. It's so that you look at the picture. Okay, it's a cool picture. It relates to what he's talking about. But now let's go back to listening to what he's actually talking about, as opposed to reading a slide that's chock full of text.
Okay, great. I think from here, I'm not really seeing any more questions coming in, but a lot of thank yous. And so looks like we can wrap up here. Oh, actually, sorry, stopped prematurely. For eye contact, do you cycle through someone in each section of the audience? Do you scan through people slowly? How do you manage eye contact in a large group?
When I was a member of Toastmasters, I was told that you should focus on someone's eyes for 3 seconds and then move on to the next person. And I think that's a useful tip. But as I also said, I don't like looking at people's eyes. I'll forget what I'm going to say. So if you want to look at somebody, look at their eyebrows for 30 seconds and then scan to another part of the audience. It helps to help it. And by doing that, it helps for people to feel engaged, that you're actually, you're taking in what they're giving you as well. Because it's kind of an energy exchange when you give a presentation, really. although with virtual that makes it a lot more difficult, but certainly for on-site presentations, you're giving and the audience is giving back. It's kind of it's an exchange, and it's really difficult to exchange with people if you're not looking at them, or at least looking at their eyebrows.